Okay, so anyway, it's good to be with you all here in our sanctuary, and it's good to be with all of you on Zoom. I feel so blessed, and I know I keep saying this every Sunday, but I mean it from the bottom of my heart. I am so blessed to be making this journey with all of you, and so inspired by your presence and by the many gifts that you share with our congregation. And speaking of sharing gifts with this congregation, Carol and I had a wonderful time yesterday attending the Elders Brunch. It was a lovely event, and I am so grateful to all who volunteered to help out with food and setup and cleanup, and to all the elders, many of whom are here this morning, and hopefully, many are also joining us on Zoom. I'm just so grateful to all of them who joined us and those who were with us in spirit. I have to say that I'm always so inspired by Unitarian Universalists who have given so much of their time and talent to a congregation and who have for many years helped it to grow and thrive. I know many of the folks who attended the brunch yesterday have been members of this congregation for a long time, and they have undoubtedly experienced high points and low points, joys and sorrows, change and transition. I imagine there have been times when they haven't agreed with a Sunday morning sermon. I've never heard that before. Or perhaps found some of the changes in the congregation to be difficult or challenging. And yet, in spite of those differences and perhaps disagreements, they're here, sharing their love, their wisdom, and their lives with all of us. So to all the elders and longtime members of the UU Congregation of Charlottesville, let me simply say thank you for being you and for helping this congregation do all the good work it has done in the past and for making possible all the good work I know we are going to do in the future. Yes, well deserved, absolutely. And friends, we certainly need to do a whole lot of good and courageous work going forward. I feel like this keeps coming up in every sermon I preach to you, but every day, I feel like I'm reminded of the brokenness, the deep brokenness in our world. And because the world is so broken, it is important now more than ever that communities like this one affirm our core values and turn those values into action. While far too many political, religious, and other leaders are offering hate and intolerance, we've got to keep talking about and sharing love and justice. While Supreme Court decisions and extreme public policies demean, harm, and disenfranchise so many, we've got to speak and act boldly for laws that respect the dignity and worth of all people. And while the voices that are denying that our climate is on fire grow louder and more powerful, we've got to keep struggling together for a radically new vision, a new relationship between humankind and planet Earth. And as we continue to live out our values, I think we Unitarian Universalists, we have to keep doing some of the things that we do best. We need to keep learning. We need to keep growing. We need to keep listening. As the wonderful words of our chalice lighting reminded us, we've got to keep being the church or the congregation of the open mind, the church of the helping hands, and the church of the loving hearts. Now, is it just me, or does it feel as if open-mindedness is in pretty short supply these days? I mean, there's way too much talking and shouting, and not nearly enough listening and learning. In a world of rapid communication over social media and other platforms, sometimes feel like we spend more of our time talking at each other rather than taking the time to really listen and learn. And look, we UUs aren't perfect, and I'm certainly not myself. I'm just as guilty of poor listening as anyone else. Too often I find my mind rushing ahead to what I think about a question or an issue, or blurting out my opinion before allowing the other person in front of me to have a chance to share what's on their mind and to really listen deeply to what they're trying to convey. And I have to say that my mental impatience gets especially pronounced when I'm listening to someone who has different political, religious, maybe even cultural points of view than I do. Now, look, I pride myself on being a good you, on being open-minded and always willing to learn and grow. But no matter how much I try to remind myself of that, too often I feel like my heels get, dug in. And I act as if I've decided that I'm right and that the other person is wrong before the words even come out of their mouth. Much like Howard Thurman and Dr. Singh during their morning conversation, I can find myself so focused on what I think or believe that it's so easy to get closed off to what the other is saying, thinking, or feeling. And what a shame, what a loss it is when we fail to listen and allow the wisdom that lives in others to be drowned out by our own assumptions and our own ideas. As Howard Thurman said so well, when he and Dr. Singh returned in the afternoon and approached their conversation with humility and with minds that were truly open, something remarkable happened. Rather than simply hearing their own voices, they experienced the beauty and wisdom that lives in another. As Dr. Thurman said, I had the most primary, total religious experience with another human being I have ever been capable of. It was as if we stepped out of our social and political and cultural frames and allowed two spirits to unite on a ground of reality that was somehow beyond our separateness and our differences. That is so beautiful, and every time I read Thurman's words, I find myself saying, that's what religion ought to look and feel like. And what made the moment Thurman and Dr. Singh experienced deeply religious wasn't a church or a creed or a sacred text. Rather, it was simply the power of being open to the wisdom, the beauty, and the truth that lives in others. I doubt that either Howard Thurman or Dr. Singh left that day agreeing about whose religion was right and who had the final or absolute truth. That wasn't the point. What they experienced was something beyond intellectual, theological, or religious categories. Something that brought them together as human beings and that united them on a ground of reality unmarked by separateness or differences. Now, as you heard a few minutes ago, I'm going to begin teaching a class next Tuesday on world religions, and I hope many of you will consider signing up. It's on Zoom, Tuesday nights at 7. We'll be focusing most of our attention on 5 world religions: Buddhism, Hinduism, Judaism, Islam, and Christianity, and we might dabble in others, time permitting. When I teach a class like this, my hope is always that the class will be guided by curiosity and appreciation. Appreciation for everyone in the class and appreciation for the religions that we'll be studying. Our goal is not to decide at the end of the class which is the coolest or best religion, or which one has the truth and why are the other ones all wrong. Rather, we'll simply try to develop some understanding and perhaps empathy for religions other than our own. By the end of the class, I don't think we'll necessarily agree or be persuaded by the religions we've studied. That's not really the point of the class. But I do hope that we will come to appreciate what makes these traditions meaningful for their followers, and perhaps maybe find a little wisdom that we can take into our own spiritual journeys. And I have to say that my own journey, I must say that in my own journey, it has been encounters with difference, with different religions, different cultures, it is those encounters that I think in many ways have been the most enriching and transformational in my life. It's almost as if experiencing, say, a religion other than my own enables me to get beyond, to look beyond the spiritual and religious boxes that I normally inhabit. And I would also add that after those experiences with religions and cultures that are different than my own, I always feel like that my own faith, my own religion, Unitarian Universalism, that for me it has deepened and become more meaningful. Now I want to close this morning by telling you a story from my own experience, a story that I think before I had this experience, I don't think I really understood how important it is to connect beyond our religious comfort zones, our cultural comfort zones. That the real transformation, the real power is in those connections. And this story begins when I met a woman about 20 years ago, and I'll call her Esther. At the time, I was a student in seminary, and this particular summer, I was working as a student chaplain at a local hospital. Esther was a patient in that hospital, and her room was on one of the floors that I covered. Now, Esther and I could not have been more different from each other. I am, a very privileged white male. I was studying to become a minister in a liberal, progressive religion that most people have never heard of. Esther was an elderly woman from Haiti who appeared to have had a pretty difficult life. She was, I was told, a very devout Baptist. I'm a Unitarian Universalist. There's some differences there. And there was one more important difference between the two of us. When we met, I was an English speaker, and Esther only spoke Haitian Creole. Now, as a student chaplain, my primary responsibility was to go and visit people, patients in the hospital. Most of the time, I would just listen as they shared their hopes and their fears, talked about their families and their faith. Sometimes I would offer or be asked to pray for or with a patient. On this particular morning, I had been paged to come to Esther's room to pray with her. I was told that she didn't speak or understand English, but that one of the nurses who was taking care of her spoke Haitian Creole and had very graciously offered to translate. Now, as I made my way to Esther's room, I thought about my past experiences praying with patients. When I first started working as a student chaplain, there was nothing more intimidating for me than being asked to pray. Prayer had never been part of my spiritual life, and the thought of praying in general, and especially with patients from very different religions and with very different beliefs than my own, I felt like, how's that going to work? I felt nervous, anxious, and really uncertain. But as time went on, I grew more comfortable with prayer. And like a good UU, I planned it out. I developed what I came to call my prayer strategy, doesn't that sound UU? Come on. Which I used whenever I talked with a patient. And here's how it went, is I would listen to their thoughts and their feelings. I would begin to make sort of mental notes that I would then draw on later in case I was asked to pray. By lifting up and sometimes repeating some of what I had heard, I hoped my prayer would reflect what was in their hearts, rather than focusing on things I didn't know much about, like scripture or doctrines or creeds or things like that. That was my prayer strategy. And in many ways, I think my prayer strategy was okay. It had strengths and a few weaknesses. On the good side, I focused my attention on the needs and feelings of the patient, rather than on theology or religion. I didn't use my prayer to convert them to my religion. That might be a first if somebody used prayer to convert someone to Unitarian Universalism. I don't know. But I didn't try to convert them to my religion or to ask God to intervene on, to forgive them of their sins or anything like that. But I think the weakness was that I turned prayer into a kind of intellectual exercise, focusing a great deal on the content and doing my best to find just the right words. In some ways, prayer became like a class assignment, and I was determined to get an A on it. Well, that morning, as I walked into Esther's room, I wondered how well I would be able to follow that strategy with a patient that I couldn't talk to directly. I had used hospital translators a couple of times before and had found it really difficult to get enough from the patient and understand enough from them to sort of formulate, to follow my prayer strategy. And when I got to Esther's room, she and the nurse were there waiting for me. After introducing myself, I began, as I always did, by asking some questions. How are you feeling today? Do you have family in the area? Do you consider yourself, and I kind of knew the answer to this, but do you consider yourself to be a religious or spiritual person? And so on. This was my prayer strategy. Always started with an interview. Now, although the nurse translated my questions and Esther tried to answer them, I could tell from their facial expressions that something was wrong. They looked at one another with what appeared to be confusion and a little consternation. At one point, the nurse very gently reminded me that Esther had simply requested that I pray for her and that prayer was all she needed from me. Now, I wish I could say, oh, okay, I understand, and then did the right thing, but no, that wasn't how it worked. I have to say that some of that arrogance and stubbornness I was talking about earlier, so I have to say that the nurse's admonition I found a little annoying. I mean, she was getting in the way of my prayer strategy. And how was I going to find those right words if I didn't get the answers to my questions? So, rather than listening and following the path of humility, I plunged ahead, asking more questions. I know, it's pretty bad, isn't it? And the longer I talked, the more confused and exasperated the nurse and Esther became. Finally, the nurse had had enough. She interrupted me pretty abruptly, and she said again, "Look," and it was about that tone of voice, "Look, all Esther wants is for you to pray with her. You don't need to know anything about her. You don't even need me to translate. Just pray, and she will follow you." Follow me? Follow me where? That's what I thought. I couldn't imagine what this nurse meant. Esther and I had almost nothing in common. We were so different. She was a lot older than me. We were of different racial and cultural backgrounds, gender, class, language, religion, you name it. We were basically strangers. I was lost, clueless, helpless, hopeless. I didn't know what to do. I was not a Christian, had never really considered myself to be a Christian, didn't have the first clue what Esther needed from me. Out of absolute desperation and even some panic, I closed my eyes and began reciting the only Christian prayer I know by heart, the Lord's Prayer. I remember thinking to myself, this is totally pointless because Esther won't understand what I'm saying. My words will be meaningless to her. Well, I was completely wrong because here's what happened. As I began to recite the Lord's Prayer, Esther did something I didn't expect at all. After I finished saying aloud the first line, "Our Father who art in heaven," before I got to the second line, I heard Esther, in a very soft voice, repeat what I said word for word. "Our Father who art in heaven." Esther, as I said the next line, she repeated it again. And then the line after that, until we got to the end of the prayer. Wow, that was a real turning point for me. You know, I was the one who had come that morning to offer Esther wisdom and comfort. But something happened to me in that hospital room, something that has forever changed the way I understand religion, prayer, ministry, what it means to be human. You see, as Esther repeated the words of the Lord's Prayer back to me, I experienced something that I don't know how to describe it. It was deep, it was holy. I felt so connected to her, to the nurse in the room, to something sacred and beautiful that had just emerged. Esther taught me that religion is not about saying the right thing or getting the words just right. Religion is about being deeply connected to others and to something greater than myself. In fact, that's how I come to define religion and spirituality: deep connection to oneself, to others, the universe, and the sacred, however one might understand that. And although I can point to many experiences and people who have shaped my understanding of religion and spirituality, I know I would not have come to this point had it not been for that amazing moment with Esther, an extraordinarily wise and deeply religious person who was so very different than me and from whom I had so much to learn. That moment with Esther will forever be part of my spiritual journey, and I am so very grateful and blessed by her presence in my life for that very, very brief moment. And you know, Esther and that nurse also taught me that the key to experiencing deep connection is open-minded and open-hearted listening and learning. Until the nurse interrupted me, I was so busy talking and following my prayer strategy, I couldn't hear a word she or Esther were trying to say. But when she slowed me down and compelled me to really listen, everything turned in that moment. I learned that I experience God or deep connection, however you want to describe that, when my mind and heart are open to the beauty and blessing that lives in others and in the world. And I think Esther and that nurse, that's why I say they helped me become a better Unitarian Universalist. We use affirm that when it comes to questions like the existence of God or the ultimate meaning and purpose of life, we don't have all the answers, but we're open, we're learning, growing, and striving to remain open-minded to the truth and wisdom that lives in all. I love that about Unitarian Universalism and have always felt at home in a faith tradition that embraces mystery and uncertainty and that has the humility to acknowledge that it doesn't have all the answers. I wish I'd had that humility when I walked into that hospital room. I didn't walk into Esther's room that day with very much of that humility, but I know that I left understanding how much I have to learn and how important it is to learn from people with diverse religious and cultural backgrounds and experiences. Now, I don't want to leave you with the impression that I've got all this figured out or that I don't make the same mistakes I did when I was visiting Esther. If I come and visit you in the hospital, I won't walk in with a prayer strategy, I promise you with that. There are still far too many times when I talk more than I listen, teach more than I'm allowing myself to be taught, and pretend to know more than I really do. But in those moments when my closed-mindedness and self-importance are running on overload, I try to remember to slow down, to allow my mind to find its way back to an elderly woman and a truth-telling nurse. I hear Esther repeating my words and teaching me about the meaning of humility, the meaning of religion, and the meaning of this faith we call Unitarian Universalism. Amen. Blessed be, and thank you so much for listening.